I'm so excited to talk to Alisha. Alisha Grogan's an occupational therapist. She has Your Kids Table, which is just an amazing resource of articles, courses, support for parents who are dealing with a lot of difficult struggles. But today I want to talk about sensory issues because actually all of your world overlaps with my world because you deal with feeding and picky eating. Sensory is a big one too. So many kids that I work with in my world overlap with your world because they also have comorbid conditions and sensory issues as well. And that's not my expertise. You are my go-to person for sensory. And so I am excited to have you on and ask you just a couple of questions to help maybe my audience see what is sensory and what we do about that. So thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
So glad to be here.
So let's just jump in. What are some ways, like just a basic question, because some people may not understand this. What are some ways that sensory can show up differently for different kids?
Yeah, that's a good question. I first want to say that sensory is based on a neurological process. So that means it's happening in our brain. And as we know, each of us is unique. So how our brain is wired is unique. And that's why we see these sensory processing challenges or difficulties, and they can show up in every which way. So we do kind of have three big categories, but as I'm talking about these, really keep in mind that there can be a mashup of any of them, really based on how your kid is wired. And it actually can fluctuate even from day to day, just based on all kinds of external factors. So one of the ways that we see kids that have sensory needs, I think often gets missed, are our kids that don't stop moving. Uh, if they're a boy, we often explain that away as they're a wild child. They're just acting like a boy. But when kids are nonstop moving, climbing the furniture, literally hanging from the ceiling fan, parents know if you're listening right now and your kid has done these things, it just seems like a little bit beyond what you would see a kid typically do. There is almost a lack of fear or danger involved uh, in all of their actions and movements. Another way that we see this show up is when kids are really sensitive to sensory input. So we actually have 8 senses, so the 5 you learned about in kindergarten, and a couple of more that are related to our sense of movement and our body position and even our internal sensations. Our brain can really overprocess or kind of overreact to any of those sensations. So we will see kids that are very sensitive to lights or sounds, the way their clothing feels, to the way food feels or the texture of something in their mouth. They may be scared to get on a swing or to ride a bike because that sense of movement is so uncomfortable for them. That's again because their brain is kind of over responding. Now, not as common, but I still think it's so important to mention, and this is definitely the sensory need that is so often missed. It's what's called low registration. These kids that have low registration, often the sensation is kind of getting lost along the way. And it's just not really registering. So kids will often appear as really lethargic. They will seem unmotivated. They have a lack of energy to really do anything. These kids will often fly under the radar because they seem so good and well behaved, but they really start to struggle when they're in school because of this kind of lower arousal level. They're just not fully there because their brain is not being stimulated with the senses in the way that it needs to be to really kind of respond to their environment.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never even heard about that. Yeah. And I
Yeah,
think,
it's not as well known, but it definitely is affecting kids for sure.
yeah, I could think that that would be impacting a lot of kids and missed completely. And I know so my oldest has sensory processing disorder, and everything you were discussing, you can have both of those. Like she was a ping pong ball, but also she had no spatial abilities. It was very scary when she started to drive because she still had no spatial abilities. And, you know, in helping her understand that it's sensory, and I get all my sensory information from you and your resources. So that's been helpful for me. I wish I had it when she was little, because that was 18 years ago, but helping her understand that it's not that you're clumsy, or it's not that you are, you know, a bad driver. You know, she bumps into people. She like flat tires me when she's walking behind me. Like she has no sense of space. Curves were hard for her when she was driving. Like it was scary. But back in the day, you know, I had to find an OT. They didn't really understand sensory 100%. And I remember at the time being desperate, trying to say, because I'm more of like a do it myself kind of person. I'm like, I wish someone would just tell me what to do, and then I could do it myself. Because the OT would come and be like, she shouldn't be climbing on the table. And I felt so judged by her. You know, she'd be like,
Oh,
why do you let her climb on the couch? And I was like, oh, you are making me feel so much worse. And the feeding therapist wasn't that great either, to be honest. But there was no book. I think there was one book. And it just, I just wanted like a very quick explain to me what's happening. If there were videos, I would have loved that. If there was your course available, oh my gosh, that would have been the first thing I would have done. And then I would have been fine. And she probably would have been better actually at this point, unfortunately.
yeah. Yeah. It's unfortunate. OTs are not all trained in what is called sensory integration. That's really what it falls under. And sensory integration is really kind of integrating this thing called sensory processing in our brain, so that it's just functioning at a higher level and not kind of causing all these snags in our daily life, because it really does have a ripple effect. While somebody may say, well, okay, they're really active, they climb all the time, but that often translates to a child struggling to sit in school and be able to learn, or be able to sit down and have dinner with their family, which is really important for, connection and, a multitude of things. But if they can't sit down because of their sensory needs and they're missing out on those experiences, it starts to fit everything. Or if a child is so sensitive that they can't go to the birthday party because they are scared of the noise, or everybody's singing, or all of the kids running around or bumping into them, it's having a major impact on their social experiences, their engagement, their social skills. And so it's so important to address it. So not all OTs do specialize in sensory. And unfortunately, I think that is what you experienced. Me absolutely makes me cringe hearing that an OT would ever say, why are they doing this, and not see what is happening. But that unfortunately is definitely the case. I do think things are better now than they were a decade ago. And therapists are much more aware of sensory, or at least able to say, I think that might be sensory. You should probably see somebody that specializes in that. But I also think it's really important to know that there is so much that a parent can do at home, like you were saying. And there are some really good books out there. But what I find from the books is that they're either written on a very high professional level that it's difficult for a parent to track, or they are kind of like an introduction. And that's helpful. That's helpful in just kind of understanding what sensory is, but it's not really giving you the next steps on exactly what to do to help your child to either improve their sensory processing or to help them compensate, because there's a lot of strategies that you can do that are going to just support your child, and that they can really learn to advocate for themselves, especially with those sensitivities when things are too loud or too bright or smell too strong, or they can't wear their clothes, all of those types of things that really can have an impact on their entire day.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of times as parents, we may not have the money or the time or the resources or the accessibility to an OT that really fully understands sensory. Two, for my audience, that might be a back burner issue because they're going to see the anxiety or OCD therapist, and they have to see the psychiatrist, and the parents burnt out and they're like, I don't have time to address yet another issue, even though you're right. The ripple effect is huge. I mean, I've seen that with my kids. My son had to wear vibes in his ears when he goes to school. Sometimes he didn't want to go to school because the kids were too loud and rowdy. He couldn't climb on like the jungle gym because he would see the slats and the openings down below. Like all sorts of things that I learned from you were sensory. So I was much better with my following too after my daughter. But to get a video or to get a course that's just easily digestible, I mean, that's why I like your resources, because I feel like you're like my style for OT. Like you're my, it's like it's the same delivery. It's like it's easy, it makes sense, it's down to earth, and it's like I'm a visual person, and so seeing it really helps. Watching something can be helpful. Some people are auditory, but you can do both. And so I love that. So I think that's a good point that you're saying is, parents can learn these tools themselves, which is important.
Absolutely. And the thing too is OT can be great. Like if you have the time and the resources to go to OT, that's fantastic, but it's once a week. So you're still dealing with your kid, the other, I don't even know, like hundreds of hours a week, because that's 1 hour at the most a week. And that's great. But they really need that consistency every day. And when you learn it, it makes life so much more seamless.
Yeah, I agree. So if a parent's listening to this and they're thinking, oh my gosh, my child definitely has sensory issues. They don't have to have like sensory processing disorder, but my son who's afraid of like walking on the jungle gym, not anymore, but and all those other things, he doesn't have sensory processing disorder like his sister, but they were things I had to help him navigate. They were, an issue for him. So if someone's listening to this and they're thinking, okay, I actually probably should do some sensory stuff, which would really complement the work that I do, because when your child's having a meltdown or when they are struggling, a lot of times their sensory issues bubble up as well.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the first thing a parent can do to address some sensory needs?
I think similar actually to how I think you often approach anxiety, the first and most important thing I think you can do is to let your child know that you see that they need to keep running, that they're having a hard time. I think sensory kids start to feel so isolated because they don't think anybody understands that it is really hard, even though everybody else is running across the top of the jungle gym. This is really hard for me. And you're right, like there's this huge overlap with anxiety, but there's something neurologically going on where that depth perception is off and they don't feel grounded, which is something that we take for granted. And I mean that's like from like a gravitational perspective. So that's going to get into like some deep sensory stuff, but your child may feel like they're standing on top of the Empire State Building about to walk across a tightrope when they're just on the jungle gym. Like it literally can feel, the physical experience can be that intense for them because of how their brain is wired. So it's so important that we start to come alongside them. And I talk all the time about coming on their team. And what happens is your kid will start to know that you're working with them and not against them when you're just coming to them and saying, tell me about that. Or what does your body need right now? Because even if they're seeking or they're avoiding sensory input, they often can tell you what their body needs, or you can offer some suggestions with what you're seeing, keeping it really simple. That's a really good first step to take in just helping your child start to recognize and even begin to self-advocate for what they need.
That is interesting. When you said that, I just had like this weird epiphany. My son now is 13, and he is like, he's got lots of phobias and anxiety, but one is heights. Like he is so petrified of heights. And, to understand from a sensory perspective that neurologically, that depth might seem so overwhelming to him, and I mean, when we're at the Grand Canyon, it is definitely deep, but he can't even walk, like 5 feet near the, like we have to cross the street, like very extreme. But I never thought about his sensory issues as a little, like a toddler, and being able to like not walk on, like a jungle gym. and his,
Right.
his adult phobia, which is interesting because that makes me a little bit more empathetic. Not that I'm not, but
Well, right, but that is what happens, right? When you really start to educate yourself, because sensory can be very complex, which is what I work to break down and to really simplify it. I worked in early intervention for many years, so I was often sitting in people's homes. I think like your OT was, and it just became my top priority to say it in the most simple terms. So that is really all of my work is really based around saying it in the most simple way and telling parents really what they need to know. So, you know, as a second step, it really is helpful to educate yourself so that you do understand what these sensory issues are. And then there are specific activities to help for all of these different sensory needs. So there's again a lot of overlap. And again, we kind of break it down into really basic strategies so that you can kind of figure out like these are what my kids' sensory needs are. And these tend to be the activities that really help them. And when you know that, it almost feels like magic because they're getting what they need and their brain kind of clicks into sync because that the void that's there is now being met.
yeah, I love that. And you do a great job in your course, Rising with Sensory, or Rise with Sensory. Can you tell us a little bit about what's included in that course?
Absolutely. So it's based on 5 modules, and we walk you through a process of how to identify your kids' sensory needs. You actually get a really detailed checklist on all kinds of things that we tend to miss so that you can catch pretty much every area of your kid's life. And it gives you a sort of profile at the end of what your kids' sensory needs are. There's also a massive sensory activity vault. So you can kind of pair those needs to what the sensory activities or supports are. Of course, in all of that, we have video lessons that walk you through everything with slides, handouts for almost every single lesson, and of course, a private Facebook group with live Q&As every month. Because I do think it's really important because sensory needs can be so unique that you have an opportunity to ask me questions. We have a couple of other OTs on our team that are active in the group every single day so that parents really feel supported in, the kind of individual quirks or the challenges that they're facing.
I love that. I didn't realize that you do that. So you actually get, the opportunity each month to ask questions, learn from other parents. And I love the idea of like understanding my child's sensory needs and then having the ability to kind of pick and choose what activities will help them. Because then it becomes just your go-to where you don't have to think about these things. So you soak up the knowledge that you provide, and then you have these tools, you have access to get support. And I appreciate that you are actually offering a discount to my audience right now. So thank you for
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. Yeah, so your audience has $50 off our regular price. And we're also going to give your audience a special bonus that we don't usually offer. And it's 10 visual schedules for kind of routines that are really difficult for sensory kids. So brushing your teeth, getting dressed in the morning. So these are just like little pictures that they can kind of track to kind of complete their routine. This is an example of using one of those compensatory strategies. So when our kids are struggling or these aspects of the task are difficult, and in those schedules are the built-in sensory activities as well.
I love that. Thank you. I didn't even know that. So thank you for
Yeah,
that. I mean, that's just such a gift. And it's a limited time. So I'll definitely leave a link below wherever you're watching this, and take advantage of this because um, it's so valuable. So thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
absolutely. So glad to be here.